do, like 3 shows or 2 shows, and you had this wine, and she kept replacing it, and you're not even aware she's replacing.
For over 5 decades, Steve Martin dazzled the world with his sharp wit, gentle absurdity, and banjo in hand. To most, he was the harmless, funny guy, the silver-haired gentleman who made you laugh without trying too hard. But behind the glasses, the grin, and the crafted politeness was a man fiercely protective of his craft. Steve didn't yell. He didn't throw tantrums, but he remembered, and if you crossed a certain line creatively or personally, you wouldn't get a second chance. For someone who made a career out of comedy, Steve Martin wasn't playing games. As he turns 80, whispers have surfaced, whispers that point to 6 names. 6 actors who, for one reason or another, rubbed Steve the wrong way. This isn't the story of Hollywood scandal. It's the story of a man who built his career on timing, precision, and mutual respect, and how, when those values were broken, the consequences were silent but permanent. Steve Martin's brand of comedy wasn't random. It was built like a Swiss watch, every beat timed, every movement rehearsed. So it's no surprise that he clashed with performers who operated on chaos and unpredictability. One of the earliest and most notable tensions arose during the filming of Three Amigos, a cult classic comedy starring Martin Short, and Chevy Chase. On screen, their chemistry was gold. Off screen, however, was a different story. Chevy Chase, known for his biting humor and inflated ego, often clashed with both cast and crew. Steve, ever the perfectionist, found himself growing frustrated with Chevy's improvisational dominance. Chase would reportedly insert his own jokes mid-scene, throwing off the rhythm that Steve had so carefully constructed. According to one crew member, Steve once stopped mid-scene and said, "If we can't respect the page, we can't respect each other." It was said without anger, but the message was clear. From that day forward, Steve kept his distance. Despite the success of Three Amigos, they never worked together again. A similar situation unfolded years later with Jim Carrey. While Martin and Carrey never officially shared the screen, Carrey was once considered for a comedy reboot that Steve had co-written. Studio insiders say Martin quietly pushed back, claiming Carrey was too much for the tone of the film. Steve reportedly told the director, "Jim is brilliant, but he's a fireworks display. We need a spotlight, not a solar flare." The comment wasn't malicious, it was honest. Martin wasn't threatened by louder performers. He was annoyed by those who disrupted the balance. Another quiet friction arose with Robin Williams, whose manic energy contrasted deeply with Steve's measured cadence. In joint appearances, including The Tonight Show, Steve visibly tensed when Williams dominated conversations with rapid-fire impressions. There's even a moment, still floating on YouTube, where Martin dryly says, "I'll just wait my turn," while Robin riffed over a punchline. Steve admired Robin's genius, but their comedic chemistry was oil and water. These weren't explosive Hollywood feuds. There were no screaming matches, no TMZ scandals. But for Steve, the damage was done quietly. He simply never invited them back into his creative world. In the realm of comedy, timing is everything. And for Martin, those who disrupted that timing, intentionally or otherwise, lost his trust. Steve Martin has always believed that true comedy doesn't require cruelty. For him, humor was an art, not a weapon. That belief, quiet but unwavering, defined how he chose his collaborators. He wasn't just picky about timing. He was equally cautious about tone. And when a co-star crossed the line from playful into mean-spirited, Steve didn't confront them publicly. He just cut ties. One of the clearest examples of this happened during a brief and tense overlap with Bill Murray. On the surface, they had much in common: Saturday Night Live alumni, box office success, and an intelligent style of humor. But Bill's sarcastic edge often rubbed people the wrong way, and Steve was no exception. During their time at SNL, Murray allegedly mocked Steve's monologue pacing behind the scenes and made snide remarks about his stiff delivery. At the time, Steve said nothing, but after SNL, he turned down multiple opportunities to co-star with Murray. According to a producer familiar with both men, Steve found Bill funny, but only from a distance. Up close, the bite was too sharp. The same pattern repeated itself years later with Martin Lawrence. The two were attached to a buddy comedy project in the early 2000s, a film that was supposed to merge Lawrence's raw energy with Martin's refined style. It sounded perfect, on paper. But when table reads began, things fell apart quickly. Lawrence allegedly refused script changes, dominated the room, and even joked that Martin needed to loosen up if he wanted to make people laugh in the 2000s. That comment, dismissive and personal, was the final straw. Steve withdrew from the film quietly. The studio never made a formal announcement, and the project quietly dissolved. But those who were there say Martin left with a single sentence: "I won't be talked over in my own story." Perhaps most painful, though, was a small but memorable clash with Joe Pesci. They were never co-stars in the traditional sense, but they were paired for an awards show sketch in the mid-1990s. The bit was short, maybe 5 minutes, but the rehearsals were a disaster. Pesci, known for his aggressive personality both on and off screen, reportedly laughed during Steve's pitch and called it lightweight. That remark wasn't just a critique, it was a dismissal. Steve Martin, whose comedy was layered, intellectual, and often self-deprecating, took offense. The sketch was scrapped, and Martin allegedly refused to appear with Pesci again. To understand these fractures, you have to understand Steve's philosophy. He never saw comedy as a competition. He didn't try to be the loudest in the room or the wildest. He tried to be the smartest, the cleanest, the most precise. And when others used the stage to elevate themselves by stepping on others, he quietly stepped out of the spotlight. Not because he was weak, but because he didn't want to participate in that kind of performance. In interviews, Steve often avoids naming names. He rarely speaks badly about others. But every once in a while, he'll say something like, "I've been lucky to work with people who believe comedy should lift people up." That subtle line, often overlooked, carries more weight than people realize. Because in Steve's world, if you didn't make people feel safe while making them laugh, you weren't doing it right. And if you crossed that invisible line, you didn't get a second take. For someone who thrived in the spotlight, Steve Martin was remarkably generous with it. He didn't mind sharing the screen, so long as it was shared. But there's a difference between collaboration and competition. And when his co-stars tried to dominate the frame or undermine the scene for their own benefit, Steve took notice. Quietly, permanently. One such co-star was the beloved and charismatic Goldie Hawn, who starred with Steve in House Sitter and later in The Out-of-Towners. On screen, they seemed to sparkle together. Funny, charming, a comedic power duo that audiences adored. But behind the scenes, tension brewed. According to insiders on both sets, Goldie had a tendency to rewrite her lines, improvise beyond the script, and take control of scenes in ways that threw off Martin's carefully structured timing. It wasn't about jealousy. Steve never needed to be the loudest. It was about discipline. He believed in rhythm, in structure, and in working as a unit. Goldie, on the other hand, came from a school of performance where spontaneity reigned supreme. One cinematographer recalled how Martin once waited through 4 different takes while Goldie ran wild with an improvised bit. After the 5th, he calmly walked off set and said, "Let me know when we're back to the movie we agreed to make." It wasn't a tantrum, it was a boundary. The studio wanted to pair them again for a 3rd movie, but Steve declined, saying only, "Twice was enough." His polite deflection masked a deeper frustration. He had felt upstaged, not by talent, but by lack of cohesion. It wasn't the first time Steve had felt creatively overshadowed. Decades earlier, during a now-forgotten television special, Martin was paired with Andy Kaufman for a live skit. Kaufman, known for pushing the limits of surrealism and discomfort, deliberately sabotaged the pacing, broke character, and disrupted Steve's monologue with bizarre antics. Some audience members thought it was part of the act. Steve did not. In interviews afterward, he never mentioned the experience again. But insiders say that during rehearsals, he pulled the director aside and said, "This isn't comedy. It's chaos." Kaufman never worked with Martin again. Even more subtle was Steve's avoidance of actors who brought tension to the set, not just in performance, but in presence. One such case was Danny DeVito, who Steve briefly worked with on a short-lived charity sketch in the early 2000s. DeVito, though respected and admired in the industry, allegedly made dismissive remarks about the project's importance and openly joked that Martin's humor was for old people. While Steve laughed it off on camera, those close to him say he was quietly hurt, not angry, just disappointed. And if there's one thing Steve Martin never tolerated in his inner circle, it was disrespect masked as humor. If you're enjoying this deeper look behind the curtain of Hollywood's most reserved funny man, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Which of these behind-the-scenes stories surprised you the most? Steve Martin never needed to win a shouting match. He never fought for screen time. His work spoke for itself. But if he felt his co-stars weren't honoring the story, the process, or the people involved, he simply moved on. No fights, no press, just silence. And for someone so associated with noise, laughter, and applause, that silence could be deafening. To understand why Steve Martin quietly turned away from certain co-stars without spectacle or scandal, you have to understand who he really is. Not the public figure with the banjo and bow tie, but the man beneath the performance. Martin wasn't just a comedian. He was a craftsman. Every joke he told was thought through, every gesture measured, every silence intentional. Behind his cheerful absurdity was a profound seriousness about comedy, about acting, and about the unspoken respect that he believed every person on a set should uphold. For Steve, professionalism wasn't optional, it was sacred. He didn't need applause at every moment. He needed alignment. And when an actor disrupted the tone of a scene, dismissed the work of writers or crew, or brought drama where there should have been discipline, he didn't raise his voice. He raised his standards. This quiet code is why so many of his feuds never made headlines. They weren't explosive, they were invisible. Steve would work with someone once, realize their rhythms didn't match his own, and then never invite them back. At 80, Martin's career is now viewed through a lens of reverence. He's not just remembered for The Jerk, Father of the Bride, or Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. He's admired for his grace, restraint, and consistency. While other comedians burned bridges, aired grievances in interviews, or called out colleagues on late-night TV, Steve did none of that. But make no mistake, his memory is sharp, and his decisions were deliberate. Actors like Chevy Chase, Robin Williams, Bill Murray, and others who clashed with him didn't get second chances. Not because Martin held grudges, but because he valued peace over potential, harmony over hype. If someone made the work harder than it had to be, or valued their spotlight over the story, Steve saw it as a signal. This person doesn't belong in his creative orbit. There's something deeply revealing in that silence. It's not weakness, it's discipline. While many in Hollywood use their fame to dominate, Steve Martin used his to refine. His most iconic performances weren't loud, they were precise. And those who couldn't match that precision simply faded from his circle. In a way, his most powerful decisions were the ones he never announced. He didn't blacklist, he didn't shame, he just stepped away. And by doing so, he built a reputation not only as a master comedian, but as someone who understood the rarest thing in Hollywood: dignity. As he turns 80, Steve Martin isn't just reflecting on who he worked with, he's reflecting on who he chose not to. In one recent interview, he was asked if he had any regrets about his career. He paused, smiled faintly, and said, "Just that I didn't walk away from some people a little sooner." It was a rare crack in the usually diplomatic veneer. But for fans paying close attention, it said everything. Martin may have never published a list, but those who know the industry and know him can trace it through his choices. The actors who never returned, the scripts that quietly vanished, the roles he passed on without explanation. It was all part of the code. Make them laugh, respect the work, and if they don't look back. Now, at the sunset of his career, Steve Martin stands not only as a comedy icon, but as a man who protected his peace in an industry built on chaos. He didn't need to name names. He just needed to walk away, quietly, gracefully, and permanently.